In 1939, George Orwell wrote an essay about the writer he loved most in the English language, and it remains one of the most devastating pieces of literary criticism ever produced. Not because it attacks Dickens, because it praises him so completely that the verdict, when it finally lands, feels inescapable. Orwell called him a free intelligence, generously angry, hated equally by every corrupt system of his age. He also said that 70 years of the most popular novelist in English amounted to one long request that people be nicer to each other, and that the request had no politics in it at all. Both claims sit in the same essay, unresolved. That contradiction isn't a flaw in Orwell's argument, it's the argument, and what it reveals about what it costs to inherit a writer you can't fully use tells you more about Orwell than it ever tells you about Dickens. By 1939, Dickens had been dead for almost 70 years, and was still by any measure the most read novelist in the English language. He was also a battleground. The literary critics of the Communist Party wanted to claim him as a proto-socialist, proof that English radicalism had always existed and simply needed the right leadership to become revolutionary. Conservative critics wanted him as a national treasure, safely defanged Christmas and chimney sweeps, and a nice man called Pickwick. Orwell thought both readings were lies, and he wrote 60 pages to prove it. The essay that resulted, published in a 1940 collection called Inside the Whale, is not really about whether Dickens was a good writer. Orwell settles that in the first few pages and never doubts it again. The essay is about something harder to name. What happens when a writer discovers that the tradition he needs to inherit, the one he actually loves without qualification, cannot give him what his own historical moment requires him to have? The critic Harold Bloom eventually built a whole theory around this condition. He called it the anxiety of influence, the crisis that hits a serious writer when the territory they want to occupy has already been claimed by someone whose achievement is so complete that anything built afterward risks reading as a footnote. Bloom's writers usually respond by misreading their precursors, shrinking them down to something more manageable. Orwell's version is stranger and more honest than that. He doesn't misread Dickens to make him smaller. He reads him with total accuracy, praises him without restraint, and still has to argue his way out from under him. What follows is that argument, worldview against worldview, one century against the next. A prose style built on abundance against a prose style built on suspicion of abundance. And underneath all of it, a fight about what a writer owes the suffering people in his books. Fought between a man who believed kindness was the answer and a man who had watched kindness fail to stop a war. Read the essay in order, and the shape of it does something unusual. Orwell spends the first third simply cataloguing what Dickens got right, and he does it with a specificity that reads like a man building a case for the defence before he says a single critical word. He praises the generosity of the caricatures, Mr. Micawber's optimism, Mrs. Gamp's grotesque appetite, Uriah Heep's oily self-abasement, arguing that Dickens's people are alive in a way most novelists' people are not, because Dickens exaggerates them into a kind of permanent, recognisable truth instead of flattening them into realism. He praises the anger. He notes that Dickens attacked the workhouse system in Oliver Twist, the Court of Chancery in Bleak House, the debtors' prisons in Little Dorrit, the utilitarian schoolroom in Hard Times, and that in every case the attack landed because Dickens made cruelty visible to readers who had spent their whole lives not looking at it. Then comes the phrase that gets quoted more than any other line in the essay. Orwell calls him a free intelligence, hated equally by every one of what he calls the smelly little orthodoxies contending for the century's soul. It sounds like the highest compliment Orwell could offer, and it is. It also does something quieter and more damaging. It places Dickens outside politics entirely. A free intelligence in Orwell's vocabulary is not a political actor. It is a moral temperament, generous and untethered, that every ideology wants to claim, and that belongs in the end to none of them. This is where the praise turns into the argument, though Orwell never raises his voice to make the turn. He points out calmly that Dickens attacks institution after institution across a 50-year career and never once proposes to replace any of them with anything. The workhouse is cruel, Chancery is absurd, the factory school crushes imagination out of children, and in every single novel the solution Dickens offers is the same solution: a bad man becomes a good man, or a good man with money rescues the people a bad system was grinding down. Scrooge wakes up changed, Mr. Brownlow adopts Oliver, the Cheeryble brothers hand out fortunes to virtuous young clerks. Orwell's phrase for this, quietly devastating, once you notice what it implies, is that Dickens seems to believe if men would behave decently, the world would be decent. Not that the system needs to change, that the people running it need to be nicer. Orwell does not say this is worthless. This is the part most readings of the essay skip past too quickly. He says explicitly that he does not want Dickens to have written a different kind of book, that the moral vision is not a failure of nerve, that a caricaturist is not obligated to also be a political theorist. He is not asking Dickens to be someone else. He is diagnosing with real precision exactly what kind of writer Dickens actually was, and exactly what that writer's enormous, permanent popularity has allowed generations of readers to avoid thinking about whether moral outrage without a structural target changes anything at all, or whether it simply lets you feel the outrage and go home satisfied. This is not the tone of a man tearing down a rival. It's the tone of a man arguing patiently and at length with someone he has already decided he cannot simply agree with, because agreeing would mean giving up something he needs. The distance between these two men is not really a distance of talent, it's a distance of century, and it is worth being precise about what separated them, because the gap explains almost everything the essay is straining against. Dickens was born in 1812 into a world where overturning the entire structure of British society was, to most respectable people, either unthinkable or actively terrifying. He grew up watching the machinery of industrial capitalism assemble itself around him, workhouses and factories, and a legal system built to protect property rather than people, and his instinct formed by a childhood that included his own father's imprisonment for debt and his own months labouring in a shoeblacking factory at 12 years old, was to attack cruelty wherever he found it, while never questioning whether the underlying arrangement of English society should exist in a fundamentally different shape. He believed with total sincerity in the reformable individual. Scrooge can change, Mr. Dombey can change, even Pip in Great Expectations can recognise what his snobbery cost him and become someone better. Dickens's entire moral architecture depends on the idea that a human being, confronted honestly with the harm they have done, will choose to be kinder. It is an extraordinarily hopeful theory of human nature, and it produced some of the most read novels in the history of the language, and it is also, Orwell would argue, a theory that had not yet been tested against the 20th century. Orwell had been tested against the 20th century directly and personally. Born Eric Blair in 1903, he came of age after a war that killed a generation for reasons most of the survivors could no longer articulate, walked through the gutted industrial towns of the Depression himself for the road to Wigan Pier, and then in 1936 went to Spain to fight fascism as a volunteer in a workers' militia. He was shot through the throat at the front. He also watched something worse happen behind the front. The Soviet-backed Communist Party moved to crush its own revolutionary allies in Barcelona, jailing and slandering the anarchists and the POUM militia Orwell had fought alongside, calling them fascist agents, while the international left press mostly printed the lie without checking it. He wrote Homage to Catalonia to say what he had actually seen, and almost nobody wanted to publish it because it was inconvenient to a left that needed the Soviet Union to remain the good guys. This is the generational gap the essay is actually about, underneath the literary criticism. Dickens came of age believing individual virtue was the lever that moved history, because nothing in his lifetime had yet demonstrated otherwise at a scale large enough to be undeniable. Orwell came of age watching virtue get overrun by ideology at industrial scale twice in one generation, once in Berlin and once, more intimately and more painfully, in Barcelona, from people who had used exactly the language of decency and liberation to justify exactly the kind of cruelty they claimed to be fighting. Even the prose carries this difference, and it is worth noticing that Orwell's own writing philosophy is itself a rejection of everything Dickensian abundance represents. Dickens's sentences pile detail on detail, adjective on adjective, building character through sheer accumulated excess, because for a Victorian serial novelist writing to be read aloud in instalments to whole families, more was the whole point. Orwell, writing 7 years after this essay in Politics and the English Language, argued almost the opposite. That ornament in prose is where dishonesty hides, that a sentence with too many adjectives is usually a sentence trying to smuggle something past you, that the plainer the language, the harder it is to lie in it. He grew up professionally in an era of propaganda so total it had its own vocabulary, and he came to believe that clear prose was not a style choice but a moral obligation. One of the only defences a person has against being governed by people who control language well enough to control thought. Dickens's exuberance, the thing Orwell loved without reservation, was also, structurally, exactly the kind of prose Orwell had spent his career training himself and everyone else to distrust. Here is the argument underneath the argument, the one Orwell never states outright because stating it would mean admitting how unresolved it still was in his own mind. Dickens was afraid of revolution, not cruelty, not injustice, not the specific machinery of the workhouse or the debtor's prison, actual organised revolt by the people his novels spend so much energy defending. Read A Tale of Two Cities and the sympathy for the poor of pre-revolutionary France is total and genuine, the aristocracy's casual violence rendered in some of Dickens's angriest prose. And then the revolution arrives, and Dickens's camera turns almost entirely toward horror. Madame Defarge, knitting the names of the condemned into her register with total moral certainty, becomes one of the most frightening figures Dickens ever wrote. More frightening in some ways than the aristocrats whose crimes justified her rage in the first place. The women who sit at the foot of the guillotine, counting heads, are drawn as a kind of collective monster. Dickens's sympathy for the oppressed, it turns out, extends right up to the point where the oppressed take power and stops dead the moment they start using it the way power has always been used. Orwell notices this, and it clarifies exactly what he thinks is missing from Dickens's whole moral system. Dickens can imagine cruelty. He cannot imagine a different arrangement of who holds power in the first place, because the only alternative to the current cruel order that his imagination offers him is a worse one. Mob rule, knitting women, the guillotine. So the only safe direction left is backward into individual reform. Change the man, not the system, because the system, once seized by the wrong hands, is worse than the system you started with. Orwell, writing in 1939, needed an answer to precisely this question, because he had lived both available answers and found each of them wanting. He had seen what Dickens feared, revolutionary violence curdling into its own cruelty, not in a novel, but in Barcelona in May 1937, when men he had fought beside were hunted down by their own side for the crime of wanting a revolution that hadn't been approved by Moscow, and he had also seen what happens when decent, well-meaning people wait for individuals to become kinder while fascism marches through Europe unchallenged, which is precisely nothing, because Hitler was never going to be reformed by anyone's Christmas Eve visitation. This is why the essay reads less like a takedown and more like an argument Orwell is having with a version of himself. He needs Dickens's politics to be insufficient because a century that produced Hitler and Stalin cannot be managed by hoping people choose to be nicer. But he cannot fully dismiss Dickens's fear of the crowd either, because Orwell had watched a revolution eat the people who trusted it, watched decent men slandered as traitors by other men waving the same flag of liberation. Dickens is afraid of the mob because he has never had to choose between two real competing versions of change and pick the less monstrous one. Orwell has made exactly that choice in Spain, with a rifle, and it cost him a bullet through the throat, and most of his remaining faith in revolutionary movements that build in no mechanism for holding themselves accountable. So when Orwell writes that Dickens has no constructive suggestion to offer, that his whole moral position amounts to wishing people were kinder, he is not simply correcting a predecessor, he is standing in the wreckage of the more radical politics he actually believes in, the one Spain nearly killed both literally and philosophically, and finding that Dickens's gentler answer, the one he has spent 60 pages proving is not enough, is also the only answer that never got anyone shot in a Barcelona street for believing the wrong version of the revolution. You have a Dickens of your own, not a novelist necessarily, a framework you inherited early from a parent, a teacher, a first political education that taught you how to recognise cruelty and injustice long before you had any other tools for reading the world. It is probably the reason you care about the things you care about. It is also possibly no longer sufficient for the specific moment you are standing in, and you have likely spent real energy avoiding finding that out. This is what it looks like in practice. You were raised on a version of decency, be kind, work hard, the good people eventually get their reward, and it served you well enough until you hit a situation where individual kindness demonstrably was not going to fix a structural problem, a workplace, a family system, a country that was not cruel by accident but cruel by design. And you noticed, the way Orwell noticed, that the moral education you had inherited had no answer for that. It had only ever taught you to identify the cruelty. It had never taught you what to do when the cruelty was the point. You are Orwell anytime you find yourself defending someone you learned everything from while simultaneously arguing in the same breath that their answer will not hold. The mentor who taught you to see the world clearly and whose specific conclusions you now think were built for a world that no longer exists. The parent whose instinct for right and wrong you inherited completely and whose actual politics you have had to argue your way past carefully, respectfully, because dismissing them outright would mean dismissing the exact instrument they gave you to do the dismissing with. And you are also, more often than you would like to admit, defending Dickens's fear without noticing you are doing it. Every time you flinch from a genuinely structural solution because you can picture vividly the version of it that goes wrong, the revolution that eats its own, the movement that becomes the thing it replaced, you are doing exactly what Dickens did in A Tale of Two Cities. You are choosing the devil you know because you have seen or read or been told enough stories about the devil you don't, and that fear is not stupid. Orwell did not think it was stupid either. He had seen it justified. He also knew that fear of the mob is not by itself a politics. It is a reason to stay still, dressed up as caution. The honest position, the one Orwell was groping toward in an essay he never fully resolved, is that you can hold both of these at once and it will not feel comfortable. You can love the moral education that made you who you are and still recognize its limits. You can distrust the version of change that curdles into its own cruelty and still refuse to let that distrust become an excuse for changing nothing. Most people pick a side and stop thinking. Orwell wrote 60 pages because he refused to. Orwell never finished arguing with Dickens because the argument was never really about Dickens. It was about whether decency is a politics or just a feeling that lets you avoid one. He wrote an essay that praises a man completely and still cannot let him have the last word, because giving Dickens the last word would mean believing that kindness, offered generously enough, is sufficient for a century that had already shown him it was not. He was right that it isn't. He was less certain, and said so less often, that he had a better answer sitting ready to replace it. That uncertainty is the most honest thing in the whole essay, and it is the reason it still reads like an open wound instead of a closed case 100 years later. The question Orwell leaves you with is not whether Dickens was right or wrong. It is whether you have actually tested the moral education you inherited against a fight it was never built for, or whether you are still quietly hoping everyone involved will simply choose to be kinder.